Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for that warm welcome. It's just a pleasure to be here tonight, and I'm really excited to have a chance to talk about an issue that is clear that's on all of our minds from the very cool data that we saw. I'm a big data fan, so that was very exciting to see that live happening. Um, Thank you. I'm kind of tall, if you haven't noticed. And I will be spending, the next 30, 45-ish minutes talking with you all, sort of sharing the perspective that I've learned over the years, and also that we believe at the Expectations Project. And then I believe we'll have some time for a Q&A at the end of this talk. And I know that a lot of us are coming to this from different perspectives, and there seems to be a lot of educators in the room already. So I will probably shift and spend more time talking about what particularly communities and congregations can do to help work on the problem. But I do want to spend some time really grounding us in the scope of the problem. Again, I know a lot of us are aware of it, but I think sometimes reiterating that just how challenging things can be before we get to the what can we do is important, not just to remind ourselves, but also I believe that we are here because we can be ambassadors about this particular issue to others who may not know as much. And so I find that whenever I talk to people that are thinking about education and the opportunity gap that exists with kids in poorer communities, I'm always learning something that I can take back and share with others. So with that, we are going to get started. So about 9 months ago, my grandmother, my mom's mom, passed away just 1 month shy of her 100th birthday. So she was an amazing woman, served God, for many, many years, and just was a phenomenal model for our entire family. And before she passed, as your grandparents get older, you want to make sure you get that history and really spend a lot of time talking with them. And one of the things I spoke with her about, and my father's mother before she passed several years ago, was just what was it like to be alive, during desegregation and the civil rights movement. And my parents were alive then too, but they were younger and weren't, able to look at it, I think, from as deep an historical perspective as my grandmother could. And one of the things she told me is, she said, I remember when the Brown versus Board of Education decision was happening. She remembers watching, the news, and I guess there was TV then, yeah, watching the news, but hearing about it, it's hard for me to remember it historically. 54, I don't know. There was some TV, I guess. Anyway, so she remembers hearing about it, and she said the thing that was so interesting to her was that as an African American, there was this sense of hope that things were really turning around for Black and brown kids in this country, and that she believed beyond a shadow of a doubt that that would change things for her children and for her children's children and now her children's children's children. And, having seen those changes happen in our country, and then before she passed away, some 50-some years after that, almost 60, she said, it's really interesting to me that actually, when I look at the state of education for kids in low-income communities and for African American and Latino kids in particular, she said, I feel like either things are the same or maybe they've even gotten worse. And I think to hear, someone who's such an amazing, woman see that arc, and to really have her come to believe, I think what this quote says here is that, we're still have this shockingly unequal educational system years later. And for me, I've seen that play out in my life in a couple of ways. One, I grew up in Detroit. As was noted earlier, and Detroit is not known for having the best education for its kids. It's known for a lot of things, probably not high-quality education. And I was one of the products of that. And so my parents had to literally find options for us. And I think it's not dissimilar to what happens in a lot of urban areas now. But the options that my parents chose were, my brother and I did not go to the neighborhood schools that we would have been assigned to geographically. And particularly when I got to high school, as you start to become aware of what's going on, it really struck me, because my brother and I got accepted into an exam school, I think similar to what a lot of kids do here in New York. In Detroit, there were only 2, though. So we didn't have an array of them. There were 2 exam schools. The rest of the schools in Detroit at the high school level were really challenging. So my brother and I went across town to Renaissance High School. And our high school was amazing. We had AP Latin class. I took AP microbiology at my Detroit Public High School. Not the norm, right? But what was so unique about our school was that from day one, it was not, are you going to college? It's, where are you going? PSAT prep, SAT prep from the very first day of high school. The difference is my friends who went to Cooley High School, which was our neighborhood high school, were just as smart and gifted, I believe, as my brother and I were. But I had friends who did not hear anyone talk to them about college for 4 years of high school. 4 years. And not surprisingly, at Cooley High School, there were very few, if any, AP classes. The statistics that were shared earlier, half of the kids who went to that school dropped out of high school and didn't graduate by the time they should have. And so as a kid, you realize the distinction of what you're getting versus what someone else is getting. And that's what ultimately led me to go join Teach for America and teach in Compton, where I saw the exact same things happening. My fifth graders on the average were reading at a second and first grade level in fifth grade. I had several students who were functionally illiterate, who did not know the sounds that letters make, right? And so this is what we're left with, and this is what we see. And for those of us who are looking at this from a justice perspective, there's obviously something going on that is significantly challenging in our country. And right now, there are 15 million kids growing up in poverty in the United States. And I specifically like to have pictures when I talk about that, because I think it's very easy to get caught up in the numbers, and it's easy to forget that these are real lives of real little people who are growing up in poverty, but then are disproportionately impacted by an education system that is just not serving them the way they need to. I live in D.C. now. And we see the exact same things happening in D.C. D.C. is geographically divided by the Anacostia River. And so on one side of the river, there are incredible public schools for kids in D.C. It tends to be very high income on that side of the river, overwhelmingly white and well-educated. And those kids are achieving at incredibly high levels, 90% proficiency, 90% advanced in reading and math at schools. Drive 20 minutes across the river the other direction, overwhelmingly African-American and a growing Latino population. At those schools, you will see the exact opposite. 10% of kids literally are proficient in math and reading at a lot of schools in DC. Same school district, very different sides of town. And so for me, when I hear these statistics, I try to bring myself back to the faces of the kids, because they're not just numbers, they're real kids with real stories whose lives are being impacted by the challenges that our education system is facing. And what is our responsibility to help ensure that many more of them get the education they deserve? So a couple of these statistics were already shared, but I think it's, again, worth reiterating. 50% of kids in low-income communities, so 50% of that 15 million are not going to graduate from high school on time. So half of them will drop out and not graduate with a traditional high school diploma. Only 1 in 10 of them will ever go on to college. And before I talk about the last statistic, I think it's important to note that even amongst the 50% that do graduate from high school, on the average, they're going to graduate reading, again, from low-income communities at the level of an 8th grader. So doing reading and math on the average at the level of an 8th grader. Please tell me what job you're going to be qualified to do if you have a high school diploma, but it's really the equivalence of, it's equivalent to what you would have when you graduate from 8th grade in a wealthier community. I have a friend of mine, a young lady in the neighborhood where I grew up. She was the valedictorian of the neighborhood high school that I mentioned earlier. I went on to the University of Michigan along with, half of my graduating class. We called it the 13th grade at Michigan. It's frightening. But she went there too, and she was the valedictorian of our neighborhood high school. She did not last a year at the University of Michigan. She was so underprepared and ended up flunking out of school and had to go into community college and get remedial education. Now, nothing wrong with that, but the fact that she was the top student at the neighborhood high school and could not compete at a competitive university is just insane. So the last statistic there, some of you probably know this is the high school graduation rate by race. It is, I think, inherently probably more comfortable for us to talk about the educational inequity issue along the lines of class and income. Race is tricky in our country. It makes us uncomfortable. We squirm in our seats. But I think it's important to recognize that these issues are so inextricably linked with race in this country, just given the history that we all know and are challenged by. I feel like I'm challenged by it every day. But you can probably guess if you read across the left, starting on the left side, the ethnic group, racial group with the highest graduation rate are Asian Americans. Next to that are white high school students. And then Latino students, actually at 71%. The next statistic, 69% are Native American students. And then the ethnic group with the lowest graduation rate still in this country are African Americans, graduating at the rate of 66% only. And so again, this is a major issue for us. It affects race, class, and lots of other things in our country. And again, for us who are motivated to change this, what is our responsibility and what can we help do? I want to just spend a few minutes as well talking about the whys of educational inequity. And again, I know there's a lot of educators in the room, so I think there are probably people who have very deep thoughts about this, and I'm looking forward to the discussion point so we can get into more of that. But I think it's important for us to reflect a little bit on why we see such vast disparities. I'm a deep believer in sort of trying to get to the root cause, because I think that determines the solution that you will ultimately take. And if we sort of get to the wrong root cause, I think you go down the wrong path of potential solutions. There's obviously no one reason why the achievement gap exists, or the opportunity gap, as I think a lot of us are starting to call it now. But there are some theories that I think it's important for us to think about. One, as I said, to understand where things have come from, but also because there is a healthy amount of debate. And for those of you who are following education reform, that sort of movement, there's a lot of controversy and sometimes not so nice debate, I think, amongst people who have different opinions on this. So the first perspective to consider, and I'm happy to share, what I personally think is sort of the root issue towards the end, but the first perspective that a lot of us come to is looking at the family. And so, I'm the first to say that parental involvement and family engagement matters. I had two parents that were very involved in my education. My mother was an early childhood education major in college, so you can know how that probably went in our house, literally from the time we were born, I'm sure. And so there's definitely a need for parental involvement, and it's all the studies show that it matters. But I think what the challenge is that often if we're and I hear this would probably hear it more so from, not so much from folks probably here, but people who are less familiar with education and the challenges we have. But I often have people, when I speak places, say, well, gosh, if the parents did X, Y, or Z, or if the parents cared more, if they were more involved, these issues would really go away. And what can we really do? Because the root cause really lies in the family. Now, again, as I said, family engagement and parent engagement definitely matter. But I personally have never met a parent anywhere who says, oh, my goal for my child is for them to drop out of high school. Like, that's the lifelong dream I have for my kid. Or I really hope they only get educated at the 8th grade level. Like, I have never met that parent, and I would defy anyone to tell me they have. I would love to talk to you afterwards if you have. I just don't think that parent exists. And so I think the issue here is not so much if the parents did X, Y, or Z, or sort of leaving the responsibility at the doorstep of the parent. I think it's understanding that parents and families are in very different places and have very different, perhaps understanding of how to be involved, have the capacity in terms of time being involved. When I taught in Compton, I had a very, I think, naive notion, I think a lot of first-year teachers do, of what parental involvement should be. And so when we had our parent-teacher conferences at 3:30 in the afternoon, my classroom was all ready, was ready to go. All the stuff was up on the walls, it was ready, and I don't know, I had maybe 3 or 4 parents come. And so my initial reaction, being a first-year teacher, nothing against first-year teachers, you may be in the room, I was pretty naive as one, and so I was angry. I was like, oh my gosh, my parents, until fortunately a veteran teacher down the hall schooled me and was like, really? Do you really think your parents have, most of them are working, jobs, multiple jobs in some cases, and positions that don't allow them the luxury of taking time off to come to school at 3:30 in the afternoon. They would lose their job, lose their hourly rate. And so I think it's that type of notion that we have to balance. Again, the more we can do to get families engaged, the better, but I believe we have to think differently about what that looks like, because parents, regardless of income, there's a lot of 2-parent working families now that can't come to school after school at the traditional time as well. The second piece is just the notion of poverty. And clearly, we're talking about this from an economic standpoint, so obviously there's some connection to poverty. The short version is, as I'm sure lots of us have thought about, if you're growing up in a family that doesn't have as much disposable income, there are all sorts of challenges that may or may not come along with that. And some of them including access to quality health care, which of course impacts your ability to focus on school, nutrition, housing challenges, just a whole host of things that may deeply impact students and their ability to come to school ready in the same way that a family with additional resources, to spend on tutoring and all sorts of awesome extracurricular activities can have. The challenge with, again, I'm sort of talking about each of these and kind of debunking the inherent challenges with kind of stopping at any of these as sort of the one answer. I think the challenge with that the idea of poverty being sort of the root issue, is then what's the solution, right? If poverty is the root cause of the academic achievement gap, what is the solution? And I feel like what we sometimes hear, again, similar to families, like if we fix the families, we'll fix education. There are people, and this is oversimplified, obviously, if we fix poverty, we fix education. So if we eliminate poverty in the US, which I am all for, don't get me wrong, if you have a plan for that, I'm sure you'll be a billionaire, by next year. But the point here is that the idea of assuming that unless we fix, quote unquote fix, and I put that in quotes, unless we help families become more engaged, or if we eliminate poverty, unless we do those things, we can't possibly solve and help eliminate educational inequity, I think just leaves us with a very difficult task at hand, because both of those are important, right? But to think that there's nothing we can do unless we deal with those two issues, I think just puts us at a huge disadvantage. And for me, it would eliminate any hope, well, not any, but a significant amount of hope that this problem is within our control. Now, the third theory is focusing more on the systems and the schools and the structures. And so this is the idea that there are some inherent things broken about the actual system of public education, whether it's in many districts, the school you're assigned to is the only option you have. So if you don't live in a certain, zip code, you don't have any choices, and this is the only school you can attend. Is it, that we are, the old standby, we're not paying teachers enough. If we had more revenue, we'd get people who would stay in the profession. Is it the way that schools are funded at the state level using property taxes in some cases? That's still the case. The fact that 11 states still don't have any funding for early childhood education. And so if you don't have money or you don't qualify for Head Start, your kid is likely not going to preschool or going to a high quality one. So that's sort of the system and structures approach. And so there are people who think, gosh, we do have a fair amount of locus of control over what's happening in our public schools, and there are things that we really, as a country, as a society, as people who can get invested and get involved at this third level, can take action there. Now, I would argue that you need some combination of all of these things working in concert with each other. It's, for folks who want to sort of live in it's all about the system and structures, I think anyone who's taught would say, yes, we want to get families involved. Like we don't want to ignore number one, right? Like you want to have that happen. You want to find a way to do that. On the same token, certainly when I was teaching in Compton, I wasn't able to meet all of the sort of some of the challenges that many of my families had because of poverty, but I certainly would try to connect my families to social services that could help them, find access to healthcare. When I had a student in my class who came to school with a broken arm and a makeshift sling and was in excruciating pain because his parents had no access to healthcare and were afraid to go because they were undocumented folks in the country. And so it's not that we ignore those things. It's just, where can you as an individual have the biggest impact? I think is part of the challenge. So I know that's sort of a smushy, sort of wishy-washy response, but I think this stuff is complicated. It's kind of the big takeaway. And again, I tend to focus more on the latter because that's where I feel like my sweet spot is, and I feel like I have a fair amount of locus of control there, as much as you can in this issue, but it doesn't mean that the other two issues don't matter. So we can change this. That's for me is the biggest takeaway that I have from working on this issue for, probably almost 20 years now since I was teaching in the classroom in Compton. And, for me, I just wouldn't want to work on an issue that wasn't solvable. There's a million issues that we have in our world and our society, and we can talk forever about the challenges and what we're going to do, but if we don't have a sense that this is possible to eliminate, and I do mean in our lifetime, I just would want to sit down and go find something else to do. So for me, we really like to come back in our organization at the Expectations Project. We like to come back to this idea of what's possible. And I would say, as I know many of us here are motivated by our faith to work on this issue, the idea of faith, of being hopeful, of believing in what we don't see maybe right now, I think we are sort of the prime candidates to adopt this hopeful change possibility in just our mindset and just the way we think about this issue. So there are plenty of examples of schools and classrooms that are really working for kids from all different types of communities. I know many of you are teachers. I'm sure you have those stories yourselves. I definitely saw that in my classroom in Compton, and not because I was sort of, some superstar teacher. I think it's incredibly hard. This change is not going to happen by blinking our eyes. But I definitely saw that in our classroom by setting high expectations for our kids. I did a lot of community investment and had volunteers coming from the church I went to in Los Angeles at the time to serve as tutors, mentors for our kids, after school tutoring, Saturday tutoring. And my parents, I had to think differently about how to meet their needs to get them involved, but they were, over time, very involved and invested in what we were doing in our classroom. And, so by the end of that first year, and again, the other years that I taught, we saw kids who couldn't read at the beginning of the year reading chapter books by the end of the year, and kids that couldn't do simple two-digit addition and subtraction problems doing complex fractions and long division by the end of the year, and critical thinking skills on math. And so I think that's the type of hope that we want to have, is to arm ourselves literally with stories and anecdotes and examples of success, because that's what we need to change our own mindset, which I believe anyway, and I include myself in that. It's a constant process. And so, there are definitely, schools around the country. Some of them are charter schools that are high-performing charters. All charters aren't created equal, but there are some of those that are high-performing. We talk about those a lot, and, I love me some KIPP academies and all that, right? The idea academies, but there are also amazing neighborhood public schools that are doing just as well as some of these outstanding charters that we talk about a lot. And I think those are the places where we can continue to educate ourselves with examples of schools, in the south side of Chicago, where 100% of the kids literally are all going to college in, an African-American community. The more that we can focus on that, I think it gives us more hope for what's possible. So in terms of what we see at the Expectations Project and what we believe, again, I said I tend to sort of stay in the space of the systems and structures, not to the exclusion of the need for parental engagement and working on issues connected to poverty. But as we think about this, we try to think again, where do we have some more locus of control? And I'll talk a little bit about how we're seeing congregations get engaged specifically towards the end of this talk. So this is a phrase that's become very popular, transformational change, and I'm adopting it because I like it. It's very holistic. I think gets at the type of effort that we really need, and I think it's tough to do, right? But those of us who have been working on this issue and have read about it, we've been kind of tinkering around the edges on education for a long time, and as Jeffrey Canada said, which by the way, he's amazing, and having to come up here and speak after him is really just sort of funny to me because he's so amazing. But I think he said it really eloquently. The same challenges have been happening for, 56 years since he was in school. And so we're really trying to look holistically, what are sort of the big ticket items that we know matter for kids? And so looking at all those examples of successful teachers, successful schools, a little bit less so on successful entire school districts. We're seeing the needle move, but we're starting to see incremental move at the district level. These are the 5 areas that we as an organization, the Expectations Project, have chosen to focus on and to really get invested in. And so, just sort of going around, and I won't spend too much time because I think we all kind of recognize the need for this. Early childhood education, again, there are 11 states in the country that still have no funding for early childhood. And as a result, kids are coming to kindergarten already behind. They're competing with kids who have had phenomenal preschools, where kids are literally coming out of there, reading and doing math at a first and second grade level, off the chart critical thinking skills. And some of our babies are coming to school not knowing how to hold a pencil. And so the achievement gap, the opportunity gap already exists right there on day 1 of kindergarten. And again, for us, as our organization is a faith-based organization, and we just believe from a moral perspective, that's a massive injustice. And again, we were talking earlier, I had dinner with some folks prior to this, and it's not that every parent has to send their kid to preschool. Again, my mom had preschool in the house, but she had a degree in early childhood. She knew exactly how to do it to set my brother and I up for success. So we were reading when we went to kindergarten. But the point here is that many millions and millions of kids are not going to have that opportunity. High quality teachers, all the teachers in the house raise their hands, or former teachers, yeah. No pressure, but it's really all about you. But no, but seriously, we know that a highly effective teacher, when you look at all the research in terms of what's what you can control within the school itself, so excluding parental involvement. A high-quality teacher in front of every class is the biggest determining factor of student achievement, period. Makes sense. But so we support policies and reforms and actions that can make sure we get more high-quality teachers in front of kids who need it the most. And then just accountability at all levels. I know accountability can be sort of a dirty word, but what we really mean here by that is shared accountability. And we look at that very holistically, that at every level of the system and every level of society, there has to be shared accountability. So I think we've gotten into this really sort of dark place in talking about education where we sort of point fingers at, like, it's this person's fault, the teacher, the union, the principal. No, it's the parents' fault. No, it's the legislator's fault. And quite frankly, there's enough blame probably to go around for all of us for allowing this as a society to happen year after year. But there's also, I think, an opportunity for accountability to be shared and be very transparent at every level. And I'm happy to talk more about that. So we're looking at it pretty holistically. High standards and expectations, I talked about that from my experience. The name of our organization is the Expectations Project. That was very purposeful because that is really a game changer for kids. It only works, though, as we were talking about earlier with some folks, it only works if we can support teachers and schools to really help meet those high standards. Sort of throwing a standard up and saying, meet that, tomorrow is really obviously not the way to go. So we again, think about this a lot more deeply than sort of just perhaps what says here. And expanded options. I believe as a parent, which I am a parent of 3, my husband and I have the flexibility to make a lot of different choices for our children, and I believe that parents should have those options too. I am sort of not, our organization is not sort of a fan of one approach or the other. We're looking for high quality schools. I really don't care what form they're in, exam school, magnet school, charter school, neighborhood school. Like, we want high quality public options and public schools available for all kids in all communities. Having some clicker issues. Yeah, I want to go back. Yeah. Can you go back one more? Okay, yeah, okay, I skipped this. I'm just going to jump back and then I'm going to click 2 forward. Thanks. So one of the other things that we believe is really necessary, obviously that was on this slide before, that sort of big picture stuff I just talked about, but I do think this mindset shift is incredibly necessary for us as a country. And, this first one is so obvious, like, of course, like income, background, race, of course they don't determine academic success or achievement. But what I find talking to people and even, to my friends and family is that it's really easy to say that, all kids can achieve. It's kind of like a bumper sticker or a slogan on a t-shirt, like all kids can achieve, like with a happy face by it. But this is really, I think, a deep shift for our country. And I would argue that a lot of folks in our nation are not fully there yet, where we really think that every child can achieve and that these things really don't matter. And I think you'd be hard-pressed to find people in this day and age who would at least publicly say, oh, like, Latino kids are not as smart as white kids. Like, no one's really saying that anymore. The whole bell curve, all that stuff. People are sort of like, I'm not going to say that, at least not openly. But I think the idea of looking at a child who is coming from the most challenging economic background, with parents who may or may not be in the home, sort of all of the, sort of stereotypical things that I think we think about sometimes with kids growing up in poverty. And do we really think that child can learn? Like, truly that child? Like, I think that just pushes us to think differently. And so it's something that I constantly have to push myself. And I'm in this work, right? To not lose sight of, yes, there's potential. And again, as people of faith, there's God-given potential in every single child. How do we pull that out and support that family to really see that actualized? But I think, for those who are not connected and who just sort of hear the statistics, meaning not connected to this work personally, I think they hear the statistics on TV. There's all the sort of Hollywood movies about, like, inner city schools and all, like, how it all goes down there. I think it's very hard for a lot of people to actually agree with that. And so what is our responsibility as people, again, who are trying to bring hope and a prophetic voice, hopefully, to this work, to help foster more of that, to help really shift the mindset with the stories, the anecdotes, the information that can help change that mindset. And then finally, I shared this a little bit earlier, so I won't dwell on it too much. But again, our notion of accountability is this shared sense of accountability. One other point on this is, I think part of what we can do is to help reconcile the debate that's happening right now about public education, because it has gotten so, in some sectors, very sort of like, as I said, finger pointing, name calling, and it just demeaning, and it's not productive. And, we're sitting around as adults arguing about this and that, and, Johnny still can't read, and like our arguments are not helping him get there. And I think that's the shared sense of accountability that we need to have. So not just, we're all in this together, like we are a brother and sister's keeper, regardless of where we choose to send our own kids to school. My husband and I, as I said, have made different choices. We have kids that have different needs, special needs. So we've made very distinct choices for our family. But for us, again, as people who care about this issue, what's the shared sense of accountability we have to be our brother and sister's keeper for all the kids, particularly those that are most disenfranchised in our system? And so, speaking to people of faith for the last few minutes here, there are so many exciting things happening in communities of faith. There's a long history, as we all know, of being involved in many social justice issues, from abolitionism to the civil rights movement. Comprehensive immigration reform is a hot topic now among a lot of communities of faith. What I haven't seen at the national level, I know we're all doing work, in many of our places of worship and personally, on education, but there isn't yet this national cohesive movement of communities of faith saying, this is not okay. From a moral perspective, it's not okay that half of the kids are dropping out in low-income communities. It's not okay that the graduation rates are so skewed by race. It's not okay that we don't have access to high-quality preschool for every child whose parent wants to take advantage of it. These things are just not okay, and we, as people who have a strong moral belief in justice, we're going to stand against these things and stand for what we think the possibilities are for our kids. And that's what I think where the real opportunity is, particularly for communities of faith, to really jump into this work and to continue the individual work we're doing, but there's a collective voice that honestly, I see it happening. Our organization is doing work in several cities and a few cities in depth, but I also get a chance to speak around the country, and just the hunger and interest in this issue. There's organizations doing work, whether it's a group of pastors out in Portland who have found an amazing way to partner with public schools in a very holistic, respectful way of the community, and have just seen phenomenal results where the mayor of Portland is going around speaking about this on a regular basis. And I think they were just here talking here at Redeemer. And so there's all these pockets of that happening. And I'm excited because I think there's real potential for us to be deeply engaged and to really lead on this issue. So how are we seeing communities of faith get involved? So we're seeing three things happening, and this is what we think the arc of change is needed to really see communities of faith and folks from congregations step out on this issue. One, it's the awareness building piece. So I spoke a little bit about that, and for us, it's again, probably a little bit preaching to the choir because you're here for a reason, but focusing on the scope of the problem, but also focusing on what we know works and how it can be solved. That idea of getting that message out, really being an ambassador for this issue, is so important because, again, there are millions of people in this country. This problem is not something they're thinking about every day because it's not in their backyard, and God bless them, like live where you can, work it out for your own kids. But again, brother and sister's keeper, these are kids that are being left behind in schools that are not helping them reach their potential. So how can we do that? And how can we build awareness, whether it's in your social circle? Our website, the Expectations Project website, has small group Bible study resources for Christians that want to engage, lots of links to other organizations that are doing great work, talking points for pastors and for rabbis who want to talk about this issue from their respective pulpits. And that's that type of awareness that you can tap into nationally, but also in your own circle. You're influential among somebody in your life. And who are the people that you can speak to really build awareness about this issue and what's possible and how it can be solved? And the next thing is we see congregations and encourage congregations and faith-motivated individuals to take action. So I think we as people of faith are probably naturally sort of heart people. We see the felt need, and we want to get involved in that. And so our organization encourages people to identify the best way that they can get involved with a public school, but also to really think about how to have the biggest impact on student outcomes. Again, that's what we're about. We're about helping students achieve and reach their potential. And in some cases, so in Indianapolis, where we're doing work in depth, we have sort of mapped the city as best we can and identified what are the most highly impactful ways to get involved, because I constantly have folks in congregations saying, well, we're doing tutoring through our church or through our mosque or our synagogue, but we have no idea if it's actually really helping the kids. How can we know it's helping? So we try, which is a challenge, we have identified a handful of programs, I'm sure there are more, in the cities where we're working, where we know they're actually really having an impact on kids. If kids get tutored by, folks in the United Way's Read Up program in Indianapolis, those kids are significantly outperforming kids from the same demographic who aren't involved. So really thinking through, strategically and thoughtfully, if we're going to take action, how can we have the biggest impact? Now, some congregations may decide they want to have the biggest impact on engaging parents, which for us is an important value. So particularly for African American clergy that we're working with, they time and time again are like, okay, sis, we want to help the parents right outside our doors who are struggling to figure out, how do I engage in the schools and how do I best help my child? How do I become an advocate for what they need? And so we're taking a different approach with those clergy by connecting them to resources that are going to help them meet their needs. The third way that I think folks can get involved is truly at the advocacy level. There's so much work to be done. So I'll give the example of the church that I go to in DC. We started out by working with a public school where, there was interest by our folks in our congregation. Well, let's just start, and we started by doing backpack supplies, right? This is very common amongst our congregations, and that we came to the decision as a church, and I promise you, I was not sort of like being the puppet master, like making people think this way. This happened organically at our church, but we got to the point where people were saying, this is great to give backpack supplies, but I'm finding out that we're giving supplies to kids and we're starting to work with them, realize like they can't read, they're behind in school. Maybe we should start tutoring at the school. So that sort of was the next thing. We worked with the school district to find like what's a rigorous tutoring program we could do. And so a cadre of people started doing that. And then people started, after about a year or so in the school, they were like, there's such huge teacher turnover at the school. All these new teachers are coming and they're leaving within, 6 months in some cases, and we've seen the kids we're tutor have like, every time we talk to them, it seems like they have a different teacher, like what's going on there? And so as we discussed this, the folks in our church thought, obviously we can't tell the principal what to do, and we're being very respectful of what's going on, but is there some way that we can, connect the new teachers at our school to district programs that already exist, maybe to mentor new teachers? And so that's the level of engagement that our church has gone to, because they were sort of started at the initial sort of felt need, went to the academic need, and then went to the systemic need, and now they're advocating, to bring more money for mentoring new teachers in the entire school district, and they're speaking to the school board about this. And that is the type of advocacy that I think grows naturally when we get involved. And, I know education policy issues are, more or less interesting for some of us, but I think that's where we can start to see the impact. And I believe the program and the advocacy our church is doing is going to have an impact on thousands of kids and hundreds of teachers across the school district. And that to me is exciting, and I think there's huge potential there. So for those of you who are interested in staying more connected with what we're doing, have at it. Happy to stay engaged. And, I just think that this issue is, for me, and I didn't text my response, but I would have said it's the most important issue that we're facing and the most important inequity. But when you think about where kids are going to end up if they don't have an education that's going to allow them to reach their potential, as a Christian, I look at this from the standpoint of it's a justice issue. It's, I believe God cares deeply about kids. It's very clear in his word. But I also believe it's a human potential issue. I believe that we're created in God's image, and every single person has been created in God's image. And I often think about, what if someone's potential and the plan and purpose that God has for their life is so deeply connected to the education they get. Perhaps they're meant to be a Supreme Court justice or, a physician, something that is so deeply connected to having an excellent education, and they don't get that. And, they're in the 8th grade and they're reading at a 4th grade level. They're never going to get to that. And sometimes I literally close my eyes and envision just thousands of little potentials left on the floor of our nation's urban and rural low-income classrooms every year, where it's just falling there on the floor because the kids are not able to tap into what God has inherently put in them. And for me, that's why I do this work every day, and I think that's why many of you are here, because you feel such a deep sense of calling to help ensure that kids can live their best life and can learn and grow and contribute and be confident. And yes, and we hope that they can get out of poverty for those that are stuck in poverty, but it's also about the potential and them fulfilling the purpose that God has for them. So thank you for your attention and your interest in this topic. We need many more people focused on this issue, and so I think we're now going to wrap up here and take questions. So thank you.